Hello, and welcome to Politics at Jack and Sam's Daily, the mini podcast that gives you everything you need to know about the day ahead in British politics in less than 20 minutes, or even faster if, according to Sam, some people listen to it at 1.25 times speed, if you can imagine such a thing. Is that true, Sam?
I think it is. It's fairly horrific. Hello there, it's Tuesday the 10th of September. My name is Sam Coates of Sky News, and with me in another part of South East London is Jack Blanchard of Politico. And today, like every weekday, we're going to tell you what's coming up in the day ahead in British politics. We've been reading the papers, watching the interviews, speaking to the advisors and the politicians, and digesting it all, and then telling you about it on this podcast.
I'm deeply disappointed this morning, Sam, for two reasons. One is that there's a crisis in my house. We've run out of coffee, and I've had to break out the emergency decaf that was bought a few years ago as some sort of health kick and has been sitting in a tin. So if you see me pass out in the next 20 minutes while we're doing this podcast, you'll know why. But also disappointed to see you in your house, Sam. I thought you were going to be in some hotel room somewhere down at the TUC. You've managed to get out of your first conference night away, have you?
I was down in Brighton yesterday. TUC conference is the smallest of the conferences that you go to, and at times it could feel a little bit bleak in Brighton without all the paraphernalia that you get with the bigger ones. I wasn't really sure what to expect. I suppose I was anticipating a bit more of a victory rally. After all, this is a part of the Labour movement that has just got into government, giving the Labour Party and the unions much more scope for getting the kind of agenda that they want. But it was all a bit flat. When you talk to people privately, and I talked to several of the biggest union figures there, they're even more concerned sort of behind the scenes than they are from the podium, just ever so slight niggles about the direction of this government, quite how it's going about things, whether they're all united and pulling in the same direction. And interestingly, the big concern down there is just how the government's doing on stuff where the unions agrees with business, industrial policy, jobs, the future of British business, all of that kind of stuff was on the table. They just don't quite know where this government is going. So it's going to be a very interesting relationship, I have to say. So TUC matters, as you'll find out. How's today shaping down, Jack?
There's actually loads of stuff going on today. This is maybe the biggest day of the week ahead. We've got the big vote in the House of Commons on the winter fuel allowance happening this afternoon. That's after Keir Starmer's speech at the Trade Union Congress, which is happening this morning, when no doubt he'll be addressing the concerns about the winter fuel cuts, amongst other things. It's also a big day in the prison sector, because today is a day a lot of the prisoners who are getting early released are going to be released under the government's new programme to try and reduce crowding in the prisons. So that's a big moment as well. And we've got Anthony Blinken in town, the US Secretary of State. He is meeting with David Lammy and indeed Keir Starmer today, and there's going to be a joint Blinken-Lammy press conference in the Foreign Office at around lunchtime. And if that wasn't enough news for you, we've got the next round of the Tory knockout contest as well. It's sort of the FA Cup fourth round day today, when somebody else, one of the five candidates, will be thrown out of the contest and we will be down to the final four. So absolutely loads going on, Sam, in Westminster and in Brighton today. But
before we get to that, even bigger than anything on the domestic agenda has been a change picked up overnight in Germany. And this really is a big deal. It appears that Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, in an effort to save his skin ahead of yet more regional elections later this month and general elections to come, is instituting border checks. Now, of course, the EU famously has an open border policy, the Schengen policy. Yet, after a series of incidents, Germany yesterday announced it will institute checks at its land borders, and it's got 9 different countries on its border, for 6 months in order to reduce what it calls irregular migration. This has already resulted in squeals from the rest of the EU, because freedom of movement, as Britain knows better than anyone else, is a core part of the EU package and deal. This is potentially a big change, the way the EU works, and a big spanner in the works to, the European Commission and those who believe that freedom of movement underpins the entire project.
Yeah, it's worth saying Germany already had introduced temporary border controls on 4 of those borders last year along its eastern side. So this is an extension of what it was doing. But as you say, the direction of travel, more border controls, not fewer border controls, is definitely not what the European Commission wants to see. You are allowed to do this as a sort of temporary measure if you sort of claim your country is under threat of national security. But, when does a temporary measure stop being a temporary measure? Are they going to repeal this in another few months' time, given there's a German election now a year away? Hard to believe that's the case, although maybe. So, yeah, it's definitely not a good sign for those in Europe who love the idea of more and more integration, but perhaps a reflection of the realpolitik in Germany as election time, looms next year.
But the big news in Westminster today is the vote that we're going to get later today on the winter fuel allowance cuts that Rachel Reeves announced just before the summer that has triggered a rebellion in the Labour Party. And that all comes to a head probably around about 3 o'clock-ish, if there are no statements. There'll be a debate on the winter fuel allowance from about 12:30, depending on what other business there is in the Commons, which could put it back. A 90-minute debate. And then a vote maybe between 2 and 3. Rachel Reeves is personally opening the debate. Liz Kendall, the Work and Pension Secretary, is closing it. It's a binding vote. The government will win. It will win by a very big margin. But, Jack, that's not the issue.
Well, I would say it is the issue. I mean, at the end of the day, there's a lot of noise around this, and we will all be watching very closely to see how many Labour MPs rebel against this. I would expect a very, very, very small number, given last time there was rebellion, they all got whip suspended by the party. And perhaps more realistically, how many Labour MPs abstain, choose not to vote on this issue, don't want to put their name on it in an act of defiance, but a rather sort of flimsier act of defiance against the leadership. But at the end of the day, Keir Starmer has a massive majority and he can do what he wants. And so how much this actually matters, I think, is a question for conjecture. It's certainly creating a lot of noise in Westminster. It's on lots of the front pages today. There will be lots of chatter if 20, 30 Labour MPs choose to abstain. Does that matter that much to Keir Starmer? Is that a real threat to his authority? Does that indicate that he's got big problems further down the line, given he's got a majority of 170, whatever it is? I don't know, Sam. I mean, I think there are always going to be difficult decisions that the government is going to have to take. Some people think that this is a disaster for Rachel Reeves. I'm not so sure. I think the government is very intent on holding firm, and it's obviously got the numbers to do so. So, the noise around it at the end of the day is just that in Westminster.
I agree on numbers. I think that the actual number who will vote against this motion, who are still Labour MPs, so that doesn't include the 7 or so that were suspended, will be less than 10. There could be a dozen or two who abstain, although it's going to be very hard to work out who is abstaining as a matter of principle and who is simply absent. So that the sort of we're going to be looking for absent names, and that never is terribly satisfying in telling you how people are what people are thinking. In a sign of where this rebellion is going, one of the leaders of this debate has been left-wing MP Rachel Maskell. And she went as far as writing in the Telegraph a few days about how this policy would mean pensioners dying, or an increase in excess deaths, as she put it. And she is going to abstain. So that kind of tells you the direction of travel of this rebellion. I suppose that the only question, and you're right, the question is not whether or not this won't pass, or whether or not Rachel Reeves will sail through. It's whether or not it leaves a lasting footprint on the government and changes the way that they're thinking about the budget, maybe scares them off some of the things that they might otherwise have done. I think one thing is true, Jack. I sat there and watched Rachel Reeves when she made the winter fuel announcement just before the summer. And the way it was presented in the press conference, they did not expect a fuss on this scale. So quite how they got themselves into this mess, whether or not number 10 was signing up for the scale of fuss that number 11 caused, and whether or not number 10 just start to double check number 11's homework in future as a consequence, that those are the kind of things I think might be the enduring legacy of what we're seeing right now. But I'm not sure otherwise there is a lasting impact. There are some in government who think it's quite helpful when the whole issue goes to the Lords on Wednesday. There is what's known as a fatal motion tabled by Tory peer Ros Altman, but that's not getting much traction even amongst prominent Tory peers because they think it's unconstitutional. But I think otherwise, I think the government will sail through sort of not many dead.
I would make a couple of points. One thing that I would be a bit more concerned about if I was Keir Starmer than a handful of Labour MPs abstaining on this is briefing against the policy and against government by ministers and indeed cabinet ministers in the Times today. Like when you're 3 months into government after a landslide election victory and you really should be at your most powerful. The Prime Minister would not expect to see members of his own cabinet slagging this policy off in the pages of the Times. They are, of course, anonymous. But it has deeply upset people in the government and particularly in the Treasury to see that, and you can understand why. And I would, and for Keir Starmer, for him not to be able to hold a tight enough ship on his own cabinet on this, I would say looks potentially problematic as we go further down the line with more difficult decisions, as the government will describe them, to come. The other thing, Sam, in terms of how they happened upon this policy, there's a really interesting piece in The Guardian that picks up on something that George Osborne, of all people, said last week, which sort of suggests that. And you hear this from other cabinet ministers when they first come into a job. When you come in, your officials will try and present you with some of the policies that they've been trying to get through for years. And cabinet minister after cabinet has gone, yeah, no, I don't want to do that. I don't want to be the person that does that. And the sort of officials will go away and take that away and think, oh, well, maybe next time. There is a suggestion that there are senior people in the Treasury who've been trying to means test this benefit for a very long time, and successive governments have said, no, we don't want to do that, no, we don't want to do that. And this time they found a willing Chancellor who was looking for cuts, who was listening and said, yeah, OK, that seems like a sensible idea. And now there's a political storm, that the exact thing that had been foreseen by her predecessors. And so that Rachel Reeves might be a little bit annoyed with her officials who presented her with this option and not appreciating the political storm it would kick off. That's certainly what George Osborne was hinting at on his podcast last week, and if you read The Guardian today, you'll see lots of former Treasury insiders saying the same thing.
The question is, I think the Labour movement, the Labour government would expect Rachel Reeves to stand up to officials who were pushing ideas that, you know, maybe weren't fit for purpose. And all of this is in a context where Rachel Reeves is asking for £5, £6, £7 billion of cuts from Whitehall departments. So there's a bigger game when cabinet ministers brief against policies like this. They're trying to kind of, as it were, destabilise the strength of the Treasury in order to have to push back in other areas where they're uncomfortable. This is one more thing about the politics, and that's raised by Daily Telegraph political editor turned think tanker, now turned consultant for Appellate Advisors, James Kirkup. Here's his question.
I'm interested to know whether you think the size of their majorities is a big factor in the winter fuel rebellion or disquiet. We know that their average majority is a lot lower than in previous parliaments, and I'm curious to know if you think that those small majorities are playing on the minds of those new members, making them more susceptible to pressure from outside influences and fueling the feeling of rebellion in this parliament.
Do smaller majorities of incumbent Labour MPs matter? Well, it's certainly true that the 2024 general election produced a large rise in the number of very marginal seats compared with most other recent elections. I did a bit of a count, and there are 51 Labour MPs with majorities of less than 5%. This does strike me as what could be an ongoing issue. At the moment, Labour MPs flush from victory, but as they spy that, you know, as the next election gets closer, they look at their small majority, they worry what happens to the Reform UK vote, which could go up or it could disappear and return to the Tories. I think that there is going to be more and more angst. In 3 years' time, will Labour MPs be sticking with the leadership quite as firmly as they are now?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. I hadn't realised there were quite so many Labour MPs on the brink, but I suppose that is a sort of natural consequence of such a big landslide victory and winning in so many places Labour hadn't expected to win. I mean, if that is why that there are lots of rumblings of discontent, that is certainly a worrying sign for the government, because this is not going to be the last difficult vote these MPs are going to have. And if they really think they can hang on to their seats by defying the government again and again, then I think that's probably a bit of an optimistic reading of it. You would hope MPs have got a little bit more of a long-term brain on themselves than that. But the truth is, as we know, Sam, there's nothing that matters to MPs more than hanging on to their jobs. So it'll certainly be a driver in their minds, amongst other things as well.
Let's look at the prison releases, which no doubt is going to dominate a lot of the news. This is a decision made by Shabana Mahmood, the new Justice Secretary, fairly soon into her time in post, she says, as a consequence of how the Tories left the prisons in an absolute state. The most striking voice this morning is the Chief Inspector of Prisons, Charlie Taylor, who's been out and about on Sky. And the language that he uses about this decision, which again, the government say they were forced into, is very striking. He talks about mayhem in communities as a result of what's going on. The basic point that he's making is that, normally there are about 1,000 prisoners a week coming out. And they'll still come out this week. But on top of that, you've now got another 1,700 other prisoners. And then in October, another tranche of around 2,000 prisoners coming out. And that's going to put risks on local communities and greater strain on the already stretched probation services. The numbers are pretty hideous. In prisons, the conditions are terrible. Of 32 prisons, 30 were poor or insufficiently good, and 60% of prisons are overcrowded. So he's worried that many of the people coming out are unfit for release in the community, and this is just going to increase risks. This is not going to be an arc of a story that this government enjoys, particularly if any lines can be drawn between people who are released and offences that are committed.
Yeah, and you'd have to assume that sooner or later that story that you're envisaging is going to erupt. And the key thing from a political point of view is the Labour land this message that this is not their fault. And I think, to be fair to the government, of all the different messes that they have inherited, it's hard to see one bigger than prisons or more immediate than prisons. No government wants to just be letting prisoners out early. It's a terrible look, not what the public like at all. What else are they supposed to do? And I think the probation services point is a good one. Don't forget that Chris Grayling, remember him, tried to privatise the probation services, which was a bit of the justice system that was actually working quite well about 10 or so years ago, and that was another disaster. And so I think, that there is definitely a lot of risk to this for the government. And as I say, politically, the key thing for them is, who do they think the public actually think is to blame for this? Is it the people that have been in power for a few months, or is it the people that were in power for the previous 14 years?
Right, let's do two more topics. US Secretary of State is in the UK. He's seeing Keir Starmer and David Lammy. Why, Jack?
Well, that is a really good question. I mean, it's striking to me that Anthony Blinken has chosen to fly in today for a meeting with both the two most important diplomats in the UK, the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary, just before Keir Starmer flies out for this surprise, unexpected trip to the White House on Friday, which none of us knew about and Downing Street didn't tell us about until the White House put out an announcement last weekend. And all of this sudden flurry of diplomacy comes just a few days after the UK suspended some arms sales to Israel. Now, it could be that America wants to talk very, very keenly about that. It could be that the Ukraine war is developing and there is a need for a flurry of diplomacy about that. But it's striking to me that these two visits have come very suddenly out of the blue at a pivotal time in both of those conflicts.
Ukraine, I think, and the use of UK weapons, if they have been given to Ukraine in Russia, I think is one of the big issues that's on the table in this dialogue this week, as well as the halting, stuttering Middle East peace process, all coming to head on Friday. Worth saying, I think it was an objective of this trip on Friday for the Prime Minister to see either or both of Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. That now appears to be off the table. Government sources confirming that neither meeting will be taking place. They say it's completely routine, but that will be awkward. I suspect that they'll want to see, the Prime Minister will want to see either or both of them when he goes later this month to the UN General Assembly. So a bit of scrambling on diaries there. We've got 90 seconds to do the Tories. Jack, who's going to be kicked out?
Well, we have to assume it's Mel Stride, but we could be wrong. As per yesterday, it's all so close that we don't actually know. There are 5 candidates left. There will be 4 at the end of today. At about 5 o'clock, we'll get the announcement of the second round of voting by Tory MPs. And whoever these final 4 are will be the 4 that head off to the party conference in Birmingham at the end of the month to strut themselves on the stage before Tory party members, before it gets whittled down to a final 2.
Bob Blackman, the chairman of the 1922, will read out the result at 5 o'clock in committee room 14. We'll all be watching. You'll be able able to know the state of the race, what will happen at Tory conference. That is another big moment on a very big day in British politics.
All right, that'll do very much for us. We should say happy birthday to Sue Gray, Sam. According to Playbook, it's her birthday today. So you get very upset when we don't remember important people's birthdays. So if that's right, then happy birthday, Sue. I'm sure you're listening.
Happy birthday, Sue Gray.
Bye-bye.
See you tomorrow.